Hello friends, in this video today we are going to continue working on the ERQ, the paired passage ERQ that we were just working on together in class today. So far we have completely finished our first paragraph, and we have also gone in together and written the first sentence of our second paragraph. Before we get into the E1s and the E2s, I want to backtrack just a little bit and go back to the answer that we came up with at the very beginning. So we're going back to our answer in our because box. I'm actually just going to read this to you again, and I'm going to point out something as I read this. So we decided that wildlife parks should keep kangaroos and koalas in captivity, and the reasons why we decided that this was an okay thing for them to do is because it allows people to interact with these animals safely. So in class we talked about how interacting with wild animals can be a bit dangerous. So if you want to have an experience with a wild animal, you can go to one of these parks and you can experience them in a way that's going to be safe for you. And then we also discussed how visiting one of these wildlife parks is going to help you learn a lot about the animals as well. The word that I want to point out here is this word right here, safely. So our first E1 and E2 focused a little bit more so on the learning part of visiting a wildlife park. So for our second paragraph, which we are about to work on together, I want us to focus on the safety aspect. So we're going to be talking a lot about how if you want to interact with a koala or if you want to interact with a kangaroo, it's a lot safer to do that in a wildlife park than it is to do that actually out in the wild. Our first sentence, again, this is review, we talked about this in class, says, Passage 2 titled Kangaroos and Koalas supports the use of wildlife parks as well. We are ready to start into our first E1 here. And remember, E1 stands for evidence, and it tells us that we're going to find our evidence from passage 2. Anytime that we are going to cite textual evidence, we always want to have a good sentence starter like the text says, and then we're going to add our opening quotation marks. Remember, the job of quotation marks is to let our audience know that what we are about to say is not our words, it is the author's words. To find our evidence, we have to go back to the passage, and we are specifically focusing on passage number 2. And remember, like I said just a moment ago, we are focused on safety. Now, for this first E1, I have done the hard work for you, and as you're going to see here on my screen, I have actually already highlighted some evidence that I want us to focus on. It is highlighted in the color yellow. I'm going to read it to you, and I would like you to follow along with me. It says, since they can be dangerous. Remember, we're focused on safety. Since they can be dangerous, the safest interaction to have with kangaroos are those found in wildlife parks. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds to me like an excellent piece of evidence because it is focused on safety, and it also talks about how it's going to be much safer to interact with these animals in a wildlife park, which goes right along with our answer that we came up with in the beginning. So I'm scrolling back down to my E1 box. I'm going to type that quote, and I'm going to have you guys write it as I am typing. Remember, when we cite our evidence, we are citing word for word from the text. So I am not putting this in Miss Dangerfield's words. I am keeping it exactly as the author wrote it in the text. So again, it says, since they can be dangerous, the safest interaction to have, and I will fix this in just a second, guys, so that it's not running off the page. The safest interaction to have with a kangaroo are those found in wildlife parks. And then I am putting a period at the end of my sentence, and I'm also putting my closing quotation marks. So this lets my audience know that my quote is finished. Remember, anytime you have opening quotation marks, you should have closing quotation marks. This would probably be a good time to go ahead and mention that if you need to, since this is a video, you can pause so that you can get that copied down. But I am going to go ahead and move on. After my E1, I'm going to move on to my E2. So this is where I explain how does this evidence prove our answer, which was way back at the beginning of our first paragraph. We'll refresh our memory on that one more time, that wildlife parks should keep these animals because it allows people to interact with these animals safely and learn more about them too. Remember, anytime we are writing an E2, our goal is to write at least 2 sentences, and an excellent way to start an E2 is by stating that this evidence proves, or this evidence shows, or this evidence demonstrates. And again, I know I've already said this several times in this video, but we're focused on safety. That second passage that we read in class talked a lot about how dangerous it could be to try to interact with kangaroos in the wild. This specific piece of evidence says that if you're going to interact with a kangaroo, the safest way to do it is in wildlife parks. So we're going to combine that information and in our own words explain that. So I'm going to put this evidence proves that interacting with exotic animals outside of wildlife parks could be life-threatening. So actually, if we think back to the text, it talked about all of the dangerous things that could happen or that could come from interacting with kangaroos or koalas in the wild. It's just not a safe thing to do. It makes a lot more sense for us to interact with these animals in wildlife parks because it keeps people safe. So that's what I'm going to state for my second sentence. It is much safer to keep these animals in captivity so people don't get hurt. I personally think kangaroos and koalas are pretty cute animals, and you know, if I saw one in the wild, especially koala, I might be tempted to try to pet it or try to feed it, but this passage taught me that that is a terrible idea, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels that way, and so it would be much safer for me to interact with those animals in wildlife parks. Okay, I am actually going to leave you here. You have one more E1, one more E2, and then a concluding sentence, and I want you to try those on your own. We are going to refer back to the second passage, so that was the longer text, and since our first piece of evidence focused on kangaroos, I'm going to encourage you when you are looking for your piece of evidence for your second E1 to try to find a piece of evidence about koalas. Remember, again, we are focused on safety. So see if you can find a quote in the text that shows that it's much safer to interact with a koala in a wildlife park than it would be to interact with them out in the wild. If you need help, just raise your hand. Me, Miss Johnson, somebody will come help you. But I want you to give this second E1, the second E2, and the concluding sentence a try on your own.